Judges chapters 6 and 7 today, and this follows another period of around 7 years where the Israelites are being oppressed by the Amalekites and the Midianites, who incidentally were both groups of people who were supposedly genocided a couple hundred years ago, clearly weren't. And from this we have a chap called Gideon who is chosen to be the next judge. This chap Gideon sounds a little bit of a wuss, for want of a better word, because the angel of the Lord comes down to him and says, "Hi, I've come along before God to make you come up and do this great thing, and you're going to lead Israel away from all these oppressors." And he's like, "Oh dear, no, I'm the weakest of my tribe, and it's all a bit crazy, and I beg your pardon, have you got the wrong guy?" Sort of a new kind of detail, I think, to be fair, I think we've had in any of those. But sure enough, the angel of the Lord is insistent, no, you are the guy, you are going to do all this, up you get, let's go and do it. Gideon, seemingly being a bit of a wise man, decides that no, I'm not just going to take this guy's word for it, so I'm going to do a little test. And he disappears off, goes and gets a goat and does goat sacrificial things, potters around, brings it all back to the angel of the Lord, who tells him, put this thing on this rock over here. Then the angel of the Lord goes over, touches the rock with the sacrifice on it with his staff, and it goes up in flames. And Gideon is convinced, or at least convinced for now. It seems what God wants Gideon to do is to pop into town where there's an altar put up to the fake god Baal. He wants Gideon to get rid of that and put in a proper altar to him, which Gideon decides to do at night so no one will see him, which seems reasonably sensible given it's obviously quite popular. But it turns out that people find out that he did it anyway, and they go calling for his head. There's an odd bit here in the sense that this seems to go away because Gideon's dad comes along, tells all these people to sod off, and it seems like they do. They seem to leave him alone. Very strange. Gideon then raises an army, as he's told to, but decides he's going to test God again, just to make sure. I suppose he's got the whole town gunning for him now, and only his dad telling him to sod off to keep them at bay. But he comes up with a really odd test. So he gets a sheep fleece type thing and says, I'm going to leave this out on the ground overnight. And if I get up in the morning and find that the dew is only on this sheep's wool thing and everywhere else is dry, then fine, I'm happy it's you and I'll do as you say. And God seems to agree with this. Gideon goes to bed, gets up the next morning, and sure enough, the sheep's wool is all sopping wet and the ground around it is dry. Now, there's an obvious issue here in that God could quite clearly be a kid with a bucket or worse. And Gideon seemingly realises his mistake here and says, OK, I'm going to do another little test. Tomorrow when I get up, seemingly taking for granted that God's not in a hurry, I want the whole ground to be wet with all the dew, but this fleece that I'm going to leave out again to be completely dry. So off goes to bed, comes back the next day, and sure enough, this is what happens again. Gideon is now convinced, but God is not happy with the size of his army he's raised and says it's too big, because if they go into battle and win everything there, people will just assume that the reason they won is because there were a lot of soldiers and they were a strong army. So God has a brilliant way of filtering these out and says, say to you all men, if any of you are scared, you can go home. So of course, of the 30,000 soldiers that Gideon has put together, 20,000 of them just go, well, all right then, yeah, we're out of here, and leaving just the 10,000. Not clear at all why not that long ago we were talking about 600,000 soldiers well, not soldiers necessarily, but men of fighting age who seem to be the ones doing the fighting, and now suddenly 30,000 is a big army. I assume there's not many Midianites or Amalekites for them to deal with. But anyway, God still finds this to be too many people, so all of the soldiers, the 10,000 people, go down to some body of water to have a drink, and God filters them based on whoever cups the water like that and laps it like a dog. I'm not going to do it. They stay. Anyone who kneels down and puts their face in the water to drink, perhaps like a normal person, don't know, it's difficult to know, they can go home, assuming not telling them this before they did it. And of the 10,000 people, only 300 decide to lap like a dog, which, it makes some sense, doesn't it? Because that's sort of a weird way to drink water. To be fair, so is also getting your face in it and sucking it up like that. But you think something in the middle would have been about right, but never mind. We've got 300 soldiers now, and potentially a good premise for a Gerard Butler movie. It seems at this point Gideon is a little bit worried because he's now gone from 30,000 people to 300 people, and he's got to take on the Amalekites and the Midianites. So God says tonight, sneak down to the Midianite tents and then go and have a listen in. There's a conversation you might want to hear. It also notes that the Midianite encampment is so vast that, how does it say? The camels could no more be counted than sand in the seashore. Continuing the theme of exaggeration and flowery language, clearly. Anyway, Gideon does as he's told and sneaks down to the Midianite camp. He's listening outside a tent and he hears someone telling his friend about a dream he had the night before, saying, I had this weird dream about a loaf of bread that rolled down the hill and hit my tent, but it hit it so hard that it flattened the whole thing. And the other guy, randomly and very specifically, goes, oh, that must be a metaphor about Gideon coming with his sword and killing us all. It seems God has given us over to the Israelites. This is despite the fact that these people, by definition, don't believe in God, they believe in Bull God. So, a bit weird, not quite convinced. But either way, these people are now in a bit of a panic, and it's all spreading the news that they're not happy because one guy had a dream about a loaf of bread hitting his tent. Just to keep things a little bit weird, the Israelites then the next day go down to fight the Midianites and Amalekites, but they take torches, trumpets, and empty jars. Then they get down there, they shout, they blow their trumpets, and they break their jars, and the Midianites and Amalekites all panic and leg it. Literally, the 300 Israelites go down, say boo, and the entire army runs away. Very odd. Just for good measure, of course, they catch the leaders and they lock their heads off, but I suppose that's better than being put on spikes, so perhaps less to complain about. I should declare here that I have now heard the name Baal, or Baal as I thought it was properly, pronounced out loud, and it seems to be pronounced Baal, so I've been calling him Baal, thinking it was Baal, and that's difficult to say. Apparently it's Baal. I'm going to stick with Baal though, because that's funnier than Baal, isn't it? It's interesting why every time they do one of these things, it's a different approach. And it does beg the question, does the writers just think, oh, I'll come up with a new funky way for us to do this? So that guy's going to have a dream about a loaf of bread hitting him, and then we're going to break some jars and shout, and I suppose it's a bit like Jericho, isn't it? But I don't know. Is it God just trying different stuff? He gets bored, wants to fiddle around with it? I still don't know if any of this is even remotely literally true anyway. So I guess the point is still that, well, we'll draw out the point at the end of the book of Judges, but it does seem to be that there is a pattern emerging in terms of Israelites misbehave, someone comes up to help them, presumably they're going to misbehave again when Gideon dies. Another interesting point, I think, raised in this is that Gideon decides he wants to prove it's God, so he tests him 3 times, one with putting a sacrifice on a rock and have it burst into flames, which would be a pretty easy trick to replicate these days, I suppose, but with some preparation. But it'd be pretty difficult back then, I would have thought. And then this slightly bizarre thing with the fleece and the wetness, and then realising that's a rubbish test, then doing the other way round. It does beg the question, what would, if someone came to you saying they were God or an angel of God representing God and you had to do something, what would it take to prove to you that it was actually real? I don't even know the answers to that for myself. It's an interesting one. I mean, it would have to be pretty substantial. But yeah, interesting one. Food for thought. I guess that's part of the idea of this whole project being about open-mindedness. If I couldn't be convinced that I was actually being spoken to by an angel, then I can't really maintain my open-mindedness credentials. But I don't know where that line is in terms of what it would take. Interesting anyway. But yes, we'll move on and see what comes up next.